Or all right, so I just gave you two examples there. Hopefully you can tell the difference. I am making a video today based off of a question by Will Stonier that he posed in a comment on a recent video that I made. And he asked if I would give some thoughts on how I've worked on articulation and swing feel. It's a great question. I will say this though, it's curious. So trying to define swing feel is really hard because that means so many different things to so many different people. But I'll do my best to figure that out. But let's look at the articulation part first. I gave two examples there in the beginning. The first example is how I played high school, college-ish in my life. That was like 30 some years ago, more than 30 years ago. And it was with a very heavy articulation, very heavy. And then the second example is me taking away my tongue. So I'm kind of giving away the whole video right here in the beginning. I've worked on articulation so that my articulation is not in my tongue. I've actually taken my tongue out a lot and tried to put my time and my feel in my fingers and my air specifically, most importantly, my air. So how did I get there? Well, let me give you a little bit of backstory with this. So growing up, I loved this album. And when I say growing up, I'm talking like age 8 and 9. I would rush home from elementary school, go into my basement where my dad had a record player, and he had thousands of albums, literally thousands of albums, mostly opera, but he had some great jazz albums, and he had this album. And the first time I put this on, I was absolutely captivated. I loved how it made me feel. I loved hearing Louis Armstrong's voice. It was so unique. I loved Duke Ellington's piano playing. I was studying piano at that point, classical stuff. And his piano playing was just so incredible. It was weird to me, but it felt so good. And I had no idea how to describe it. But I look back now and it felt good because it was swinging. So at ages like 7, 8, 9, I was fortunate enough to have an album and a feel imprinted on me. I wore this thing out every day. Every day I went home from school. It was like my deep, dark secret. All my friends were listening to like Van Halen and Yes and Rush and Led Zeppelin and all those rock bands, Genesis, and I was listening to Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. And, I was happy because Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, Mood Indigo, Sea Jam Blues, which was called Duke's Place with Louis Armstrong singing it, Solitude. I mean, I loved those songs. I'm Just a Lucky So-and-so. I love them. It just made me so happy. But what made me happy was, for whatever reason, I loved the swing feel. So what does the story have to do with anything? Well, I can't really say that people can teach swing feel with words. Music is an oral thing. And it's really tough to teach jazz articulation with words as well. So when we talk about articulation and swing feel, the most important thing for anybody to do is to find great examples of that and emulate it. So like for me, I loved that Duke Ellington Louis Armstrong album. And then as I got older, I moved into things like Spyro Gyra because I loved Jay Beckenstein on the alto. I could relate to that music. It was more like instrumental pop, kind of like the beginning of smooth jazz. I loved it, Morning Dance, all those songs. And then at the same time though, simultaneously, I was listening to Phil Woods. And I love Phil Woods. I wore out the album Live at the Showboat. Now, you can't get too much different kind of articulations and sounds than Jay Beckenstein on Morning Dance and Phil Woods on like Cheek to Cheek from Live at the Showboat. But I loved them both. They both made me feel good because I love both of their articulation. When I went to go play though, I think that maybe the smooth jazz kind of articulation won out. Because then after Jay Beckenstein, I found David Sanborn. And I loved David Sanborn. And I don't play alto, but I used to. And I'll tell you what, I wore out that Straight to the Heart album. This song. So you hear how heavy that articulation is. And when I went to Temple University, I still brought that articulation with me. Now, worlds collided because I'm playing with this heavy, like David Sanborn articulation, but then I go to study with Larry McKenna. Those two don't necessarily mix. Now, Larry was very gracious, and he didn't say anything about it. But just by being around Larry and listening to Larry play every week, a couple times a week, and then going out to hear him play in clubs, I was now getting a new imprinting on me. I was getting Larry's way of phrasing. Now, I still had this smooth jazz, not smooth jazz, but like David Sanborn thing. And of course, go along with David Sanborn, the next step was Michael Brecker. And anybody who's in my age bracket, like in their 50s, those two players were extremely influential, you know, when you were in your late teens and early 20s. So, but they both played with a little bit of a heavier articulation. So I remember my last year at Temple, I was given the extreme blessing of an opportunity to study with Chuck Israels. Chuck Israels is a world-class musician. He was Bill Evans' bass player, Bill Evans' piano player. He was his bass player after Scott LaFaro. I mean, just amazing. So anyway, Chuck came to Temple for 1 year, and I learned so much from him in 1 year. But he walked away, he was walking out with me after I finished a whole bunch of recitals. My senior year, I was playing on everybody's recital because there weren't many saxophone players, and I didn't really do anything well, but there was so much music to learn, and I was a little discouraged. And he, you know, was really gracious after this last recital and was just kind of encouraging me. But then he said to me, he said, look, I want to give you a piece of advice. You need to stop playing your notes like sausages. Okay? I had no idea what he meant, but I really didn't want to ask him because I was a little scared of Chuck and I respected him so much. I didn't want to be like, what do you mean? I should have said that. But it took me a couple of years to figure out what he meant. What he meant was I was articulating too heavy. Now, how did I come to realize this? Well, I'll tell you how. I listened to a couple of recordings that just blew me away, and that was new imprinting on me for feel, for swing feel and articulation. I heard Joe Lovano play for the first time, and I heard and wore out Joe Henderson playing Beatrice. I think that's State of the Tenor, that album. I wore that out. I'd never heard anything like it before. I mean, Joe Henderson, I was just like, well, now I'd heard Joe Henderson in college, but I really started to investigate Joe Henderson and Joe Lovano. And then after Joe Lovano, then I started to investigate George Garzone and then Jerry Bergonzi and all these players. And I'm like, they're not articulating like David Sanborn or Michael Brecker. I mean, sometimes, but they have this whole other thing. So then I would start to play and I'd be like, okay, well, they're not tonguing as much. So then I would take my tongue out. It's a totally different sound. instead of playing like so heavy on the tongue. So there for a while, I tried to remove my tongue almost altogether and articulate a way different way. And it really helped my swing feel. So articulation, removing the tongue, helped my swing feel because I wasn't relying, my swing feel wasn't dictated by my tongue. It was now being dictated by my air and my fingers. So, long video that I want to cut short now. How did I work on articulation and swing feel? 2 ways. I listened to a ton of recordings and really tried to emulate how they played. Specifically, Lovano, George Garzone, Larry McKenna, who I got the privilege of to be live with, heard him, live. And then, so listen to all those recordings and taking my tongue out and relying now on more my air and my fingers to dictate my swing feel. But I need to know what I want to sound like first. So listening to recordings and having that be imprinted on you, like not just a cursory listen, like a deep listening, like for hours and hours over a course of days, listening to the same recording and trying to hear every inflection, every breath, everywhere a tongue is, anything like that. And not just listening to the horn player, but like every other part in the recording, a really deep listen. And we don't do that enough. I don't do that enough today. I used to, but I need to get back to that because it really will change you musically. You'll start to hear things differently. So Will and everybody else, articulation and swing feel, take out your tongue, like for me, less tongue and recordings. Less tongue, air and fingers, dictate swing, and recordings. Listening to great players. All right, man, that's over 12 minutes long. So there you go. I hope it helped. Happy practicing.